So fact checkers from Newsweek, USA Today, I think even MSNBC have disproven the fact that a Delta Airlines pilot died in mid-flight after being vaccinated. How did they get that information? How did they debunk the story? Well, they just asked Delta. Delta said, nope, that didn't happen. So factually, it has to be false. There's no graphene oxide in these shots. Remember that? Reuters, Newsweek, PolitiFact. Nope, there's no graphene. Why? How do we know that? Because Pfizer told us there's not. So while the communist arbiters of lies and misinformation run around accepting the word of the criminal, no, there's nothing in the bag, I'm not stealing anything, the murderer said he didn't do it, so he must not have done it. Disgraceful. Meanwhile, we will continue talking to scientists, experts, and doctors collecting real information so that we can shine a light into the darkness of corruption and death that's being exposed now, as a result of these VAERS numbers, all kinds of databases all over the place, and Dr. Jane Ruby joins us. A Polish scientist has now found aluminum parasites in these jabs.
Hi, Stu. It's really interesting. We've gotten a report that is circulating now on a Dr. Frank Zalewski. He's a Polish scientist. He's a geologist, a mineralogist, and an Egyptologist. So he's very, very learned. And what Dr. Zalewski appears to have done is to have taken the findings of La Quinta Columna on the graphene, Dr. Carrie Madej, Dr. John B., Dr. Zandre Batha to a new level. And what do I mean by that? All of these doctors have corroborated each other's findings by showing all of these unusual structures. Some of them look like parasites. Dr. Carrie Madej said it looked like it was self-aware and it rose itself off the plate. And some of it sounded a little extraterrestrial and weird. Now we have entered Dr. Frank Zalewski, who apparently secured a batch, if you will, of 5 Pfizer vials. And he went through an examination. And what I mean by taking it to the next level is Dr. Zalewski corroborated the same types of parasites visually, but he took it to the next level by analyzing them, the material, that what it's made of, in terms of their chemical composition. What he found was incredibly startling. And this is what he's reporting right now. 2 of the 5 vials that he found had pure normal, what we call normal saline in them. That's a 0.09%. That's sort of compatible with the human body. It's just, people say a placebo or a benign substance. It's just salt water. It's like saline, normal saline. One of the 5 vials indeed had this aluminum. It's made of aluminum, he says, carbon and bromine. When he analyzed them chemically, these parasite-looking objects, he said it had a head and 3 tails. And the interesting part of his finding, another interesting part, is that the proportion of the size of this is that the head is about 1/10 of the length of the 3 tails. Now, he held up in his video that's circulating all over social media, this sort of a facsimile. He made it up. He holds it up in the air. It's a head, and he has it proportionate to 10 times the length of the head in terms of the length of these 3 legs. Now, what he says is that this comes in a form of what he called eggs. When he took these eggs, which were dormant, he said, quiet, sometimes very difficult to see in the sample. When he matched it up or physically put it in contact with what he called graphite tape, which is a chemically graphene, he said the eggs became very active, and he could see the head sprouting and the legs sprouting, and they grew over the course of 4 days. He shows picture by picture, by the way, in his video report, and they multiplied. And so what he's saying essentially is these things, when they are in contact with graphene, when they are heated up, he mimicked heating it up in sort of a contraption that sputters the graphene and creates heat. They started to multiply into multiple multiple of these creatures or whatever they are. So what he's essentially saying, Stu, is that this is a priming mission where you have a batch that is just some saline. Some of the other 2, he implied the other 2 vials contained just graphene. And so he's starting to put together a picture of some people getting, something benign like saline, other people getting some graphene, which then apparently stays in the body. Maybe a later shot would have, some of these, what he calls eggs. I'm not sure what.
I mean, I just can't let this part go here. And I don't really know how much longer I can actually stand doing this. You're telling me that inside of these injections, these so-called vaccines, these coronavirus life-saving measures, right? Inside of these things, there are eggs that, when introduced to the graphene, become birthing mechanisms, and out from these eggs sprouts this one-headed, three-tailed, self-aware aluminum parasite.
Aluminum, carbon, and bromine were the chemical compositions he got.
And this thing is alive.
It's very interesting that you ask me, is it alive? You're talking about carbon is an organic material. Aluminum is not.
At 6 tonight, a judge recently had to order Millard Fillmore Suburban Hospital to give a COVID-19 patient an experimental drug treatment. Tonight, 7 Eyewitness News senior reporter Eileen Buckley has more on how that drug may have saved the life of an 80-year-old woman. Take a look.
This is 80-year-old Judith Smithkevich of Cheektowaga, who is at Millard Fillmore Suburban Hospital in Amherst with COVID. She was placed on a ventilator in late December. Initially, doctors gave her 1 dose of the controversial drug ivermectine, and she improved.
Within 48 hours, she's off the ventilator, out of ICU, onto a COVID floor.
But her condition worsened, and just days after the first dose, doctors placed her back on a ventilator. Larigo says the hospital refused to give her more doses of the drug. That's when he drew up court papers and included a letter from the woman's doctor, who wrote how she improved dramatically after the first dose. State Supreme Court Judge Henry Nowak ordered the hospital to administer the drug, but the hospital initially refused.
I say to him, I've got a court order. We've relieved you of liability. My people will sign a release, and I go through the history of this lady. They still object.
There is debate about using ivermectine to treat COVID. The FDA-approved drug is used mostly to treat children for head lice, but it has been effective for some COVID patients.
Some studies report a benefit, some studies do not.
Infectious disease expert Dr. Thomas Russo says the drug has received significant attention.
Ivermectine is believed to have both anti-inflammatory properties and potentially antiviral properties against the new coronavirus.
Larigo says the hospital finally agreed to give Smithkevich the drug again.
And the judge finally decides that, look, the family physician ordered it, the hospital has to give it to her. That's his order. And they have to continue it.
Kaleida Health issued a written statement saying, "We are aware of this family's position. Federal privacy laws prevent us from disclosing details on the patient's hospital stay. Moreover, as this is also a legal matter, we will not comment any further." And right now, Russo says there is not enough data for the National Institute of Health to recommend the drug for treating COVID. But Larigo says Smithkevich is living proof that it works. She's now off the ventilator and expected to be released to rehab soon. He says the lesson here is the importance of health advocacy, in this case from her family, her doctor, and a judge.
And because of that, this woman is alive today and on her way to being healthy.
Eileen Buckley.
Sounding the alarm on hundreds of Navy SEALs quitting over these vaccine mandates. And it's not just happening in the military. Law enforcement members are also fighting back, including a veteran police officer out in California who hung up his badge over the vaccine requirement for all city employees. David Gutierrez served nearly 30 years in the San Jose Police Department, and he joins us now with more on his decision. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And, I just want to thank God for giving me the strength to step out of my comfort zone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming on. It's an important topic, and thank you for your service out there. Tell us why you decided to hang up your badge.
Well, when we received an email saying that you're going to have a vaccine by a certain date or face discipline up to including termination, and I took it as a threat, and because I don't plan to be vaccinated, and I decided to turn in my badge so I can speak up because others can't for fear of losing their job.
Sergeant, how hard of a decision was that?
Very difficult, especially after serving for that many years and putting on the uniform so many times. The last time I put on, it's emotional.
You're being forced to leave your job because you don't want to get this vaccine. Are you alone in this in your department?
I'm definitely not alone. There's several hundred people throughout the city that back this, and it's unfortunate because they were doing weekly testing for a very short period of time before they moved on to this mandate. And while most people don't want to do weekly testing, they would much rather do that and keep their job than be forced to get a vaccination. And the mayor had said that this was done to protect the employees and the population, but the thing is, they're not testing the vaccinated employees, and we all know that vaccinated people can get the virus and spread it without knowing even. So that doesn't seem right. And he also had said that the percentage went up from 82 to 85%, and he had said that the strategy is working. And if the strategy is to force people to decide whether to have a livelihood or get the vaccine, that's not something to be proud of.
I know that your department's already understaffed, so if so many people quit, that's going to be detrimental to the community when they call 911 and there aren't enough officers to come to their rescue and their aid. I know you're not an anti-vaxxer. You just don't want to get it. You don't want to be forced to put something in your body for religious reasons. What are you going to do next? How will you make money?
I haven't even thought about that. I am retired. I have my retirement. I was, after I retired, I became the reserve because I was making extra money, and I don't know if we could always say extra because, we all get enough just to pay the bills. But right. I mean, I'll find some way, and it's really, money's not important to me right now. It's this cause and my other people in the group, and it's not just police officers. It's our dispatchers. It's people in every other city function, and like you said, they're very understaffed. You can't find qualified people, and also you can't lose these people who have been here for so many years. You're not losing just a person. You're losing all of that experience as well.
Do you feel defeated, abandoned? Who do you blame for this?
I don't feel defeated at all because I have strength, I have faith, and I know that it's going to turn out right because, I believe that God's leading me in this direction, and we're going to win in the end.
Have you thought about moving and going to an area where you don't have to be vaccinated?
Yeah, I would be lying if I said that hasn't crossed my mind. But there's so many other things right now that are important here that I would not move on before they're taken care of.
Real quickly, David, why did you serve?
I served because I had a skill set that turned out to be really good for that. Just enjoy talking to people. Really, we all say we want to serve the community. I really did enjoy that. I like to help people. I like to fight for the victims. I worked in so many different units just so I can, serve people in many different capacities, and I enjoyed it.
Wow. Well, you have a skill to protect the community that you love so much, and I'm really sorry that you're not going to be able to do that anymore, but I know your faith will get you through this, and you'll find something else. God bless you.
God bless you, too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergeant.
How you doing? Good to see you. How are you, sir? Thank you. It's good to be back in Pinellas County, and I'm always happy to be joined by our Attorney General, Ashley Moody, and we also have our Surgeon General, Dr. Joe Latipo, is here. We've got a lot of people
who are behind us that are joining us as well. We'll also hear from some other folks that have some personal stories. But at the end of the day, we're here to announce that we need to take action to protect Florida jobs. And we have a situation now, unfortunately, in our country where we have a federal government that is very much trying to use the heavy hand of government to force a lot of these injections. And you have a lot of folks that actually believe that that decision should be theirs, and that we believe in having basic medical freedom and individual choice, and that your right to earn a living should not be contingent upon COVID shots. Amen. And so that's what we need. Now, we were, when the vaccines came out, we worked very hard to provide it, particularly to our elderly, but we said from day one, we'll make it available for all, but we will mandate it on none, because ultimately we wanted individuals to make the determinations about what was right for them. And so you hear a lot about this OSHA mandate that's coming down the pike. That's something that I've said we're going to contest, and we will. There's also mandates that potentially could have devastating effects on the state of Florida. One is a federal contractor mandate. Anybody that contracts with the federal government, they're imposing this mandate, and that is already putting thousands and thousands of jobs in jeopardy. And so if you think about it, we have a lot of contractors in the state of Florida that help defense and space and all these key things. A lot of great employees, a lot of great Floridians are working in these things, and yet they're now facing getting kicked to the curb. But the companies are in a situation where if they don't comply, then they would lose out on getting any contracts, which is the basic way they do business. And so it's a really, really bad situation. So the Attorney General and we are working. Now, we want to contest that contractor mandate in court as well. We got to make sure we have the right plaintiff in terms of what we can do. A lot of these contractors probably aren't going to do it themselves because they know there'll be reprisals if they do it. But that has an impact on thousands and thousands of people in the state of Florida. So we're going to be doing that. We're also, when it comes out, going to be contesting the mandate that they're going to impose on hospitals through CMS, where they're basically saying if you don't do forced injections, then you lose Medicare, Medicaid funding. Well, none of these healthcare providers would be able to even function, particularly in a state like Florida where most of their patients are on Medicare. And so we think that's illegal, that's wrong, and so we're going to be doing that as well. And that's important what the federal government is doing, but it's not just limited to that. You have some of these businesses that are doing things that I think violate what's decent. You have some of these agencies in state government, or not state government, but local government, even though we've made very clear you can't fire people based on this, they're doing it. We have someone from Orange County Fire who's here, who's going to talk about what's happened to him. And a lot of the employers are not honoring the exemptions for religious beliefs or health concerns that are in federal law. And so we have an opportunity here to take additional action. I think we have to do it. I think we have got to stand up for people's jobs and their livelihoods. So what we're going to be doing, in addition to mounting aggressive legal challenges to federal mandates, we're also going to be taking legislative action to add protections for people in the state of Florida. And that's something that cannot wait until the regular legislative session next year. It needs to happen soon. And so we will be calling the legislature back for a special session. We want to make sure that individuals in Florida have their livelihoods and their jobs protected. And I think that this is something, when we were doing the last legislative session, it would never have occurred to me that we would be in the situation that we are, with some of the insanity that's raining down right now. We took very strong action against things like vaccine passports. That was the right decision to do because we didn't want people to be having their freedom circumscribed based on showing papers. And we really nipped that whole issue in the bud here in Florida. But then now you have this where you have these aggressive potential mandates, which could potentially lead to many people losing their jobs. Some have already been terminated, and we need to provide protections. One of the things that's frustrating to me is when COVID hit and we started to grapple with it, there was a fear that COVID was going to become ripe for litigation. That'd be a litigation bonanza, that someone would sue a business and say, well, someone got COVID while in your operation, therefore, and that's not how we've ever treated respiratory viruses before. It's a pathogen that's airborne. It's not anyone's fault. It's just something that unfortunately you have to deal with. But we didn't think that businesses should be getting sued over this, and so we provided probably the strongest COVID liability protection anywhere in the country very early on, and we were glad to do that, and I think that was something that allowed a lot of businesses to breathe a sigh of relief. But I must say that having done that, to now see some of those same businesses who were complaining about potential liability turn around and want to fire employees over these injections, I kind of feel like they're stabbing us in the back after we were standing up for them. And so we're going to be pursuing a number of protections for employees. First of all, if you think about it, if anyone has been forced to do an injection and has an adverse reaction, that business should be liable for that. Any damages, there's just, you have to do it because that's on them. It wasn't an individual choice. I also think this COVID liability protection that was given, the minute you go and start mandating, that liability protection is going to go by the wayside for each individual business that makes the decision to fire people or to do any of that. And I know some of them have already done it. So we're going to make sure that we beef that up. It's also the case some of these people have recently been fired, and then they're viewed as having been fired for cause, and then they're now ineligible for reemployment assistance. We're going to make sure that those are not for cause and make sure we provide people a lifeline. But at the end of the day, you shouldn't be discriminated against based on your health decisions. And so we want to provide protection for people. We want to make it clear that in Florida, your right to earn a living is not contingent upon whatever choices you're making in terms of these injections. And I think that that's going to go a long way to let people know that we have your back. Some people say, well, why don't you just issue an edict? It's not the way a constitutional system works. COVID, you had governors issuing a lot of unconstitutional edicts. We're not under a state of emergency in Florida. I don't have the authority to just dictate. That's why you need to have the legislature come in. You actually have to pass legislation. You can enshrine protections into law. We can make sure that we're looking out for folks. And here's the thing. On a principled basis, we have the responsibility to stand up for people's individual rights and individual freedom and make sure that in the state of Florida, people can make those decisions. I think it's very, very important. It's also important for us to take a stand. If we have unconstitutional mandates coming down from the federal government, we have a responsibility to fight back and defend the constitutional system, and we'll do it. But I also know, just on a very practical level, this is not something, these forced shots, this is not something that's going to be good for Florida's economy. We have a lot of folks in very key industries. We're here at the hangar because we got a lot of folks in the airlines that are back there who are absolutely instrumental in America's economy, particularly Florida's economy, because we're the #1 tourist destination in the United States. August 2021, our hotel revenue was up 11% over pre-COVID August of 2019, even though the nation as a whole was down 5%. So we really, and yes, some people drive, but most people now fly into Florida. And so we need to have these airlines functioning. Losing some of these people is not going to be good for the state of Florida. Losing nurses is not going to be good for the state of Florida. Losing police officers or firefighters is not going to be good for the state of Florida. So we have to look at, yes, a freedom, very important, constitutional government, defending the Constitution, very important, but just on a practical basis, even if none of those concerns were things that really matter to you, this is not going to work well. And I think that's why you've seen some of these big businesses back off some of these mandates, because they realize that it's not something that is ultimately sustainable. And here's the thing, there are a lot of people that are fighting these mandates inside these businesses. I'll bet you some of them are vaccinated. They just, out of principle, do not want to have to show. Then there's others who probably aren't opposed to doing it, but they want it to be their individual choice, and they don't want it to be heavy-handed, brought down. Because it's not a free choice. If you say, get a shot or lose your job, that's not a free choice for a lot of people, because their livelihood's hanging in the balance. So there's a lot of things that are really, really important. And so I think if we're able to have the legislature come in, and we'll announce the precise dates. It'll be in November. I'm going to work with President Simpson and Speaker Sprowls to come in, to make sure that we're providing protections for people, to make sure that we're making sure, clarifying. We're in litigation on some of this stuff where we shouldn't be, to make sure, particularly these government agencies that have not followed the law, to make sure that we hold them accountable very quickly if they're firing people. I think it's something that needs to be done now. I don't think you can wait until next year, because I think a lot of these deadlines are coming up between now and the end of the year, where some of these people are going to get fired. And quite frankly, this would have been something we would have done last legislative session. If I honestly thought this would be something that would get this far, we would have made it a big priority. But I didn't think that this was something, because even Biden, remember, he said we would never mandate it. Remember he said that? We would never mandate it. That's what he said. And now he's in a situation where he's flip-flopped on that and is now doing. Fauci said you never mandate originally. Fauci said you can't mandate. Now Fauci is saying to mandate it. And so these guys are flip-flopping on this, and I think it's wrong. Now, as we bring the legislature back to provide protections for Floridians, for their jobs, I think it's also important that we fortify parents' rights related to some of the things that we've been seeing going on. We've been winning these cases in court, and we'll win in the First Circuit DCA with respect to the Parents' Bill of Rights. But if you look at how that was drafted, it wasn't drafted with the idea that you would have subordinate government agencies just totally flout the law. The ability to enforce it, the teeth need to be strengthened. And so what I'm going to ask the legislature to do, yes, focus on protecting jobs, focus on making sure people's livelihoods are protected first and foremost. But while we're here, make sure that you're fortifying the Parents' Bill of Rights. I mean, we have a situation now in Florida where individual parents have not been provided their rights in a handful of counties. Most counties have done it. Pinellas has done a great job. You look around, we now in Florida have the lowest per capita COVID rate in the continental United States, okay? But that went from being at the top of a wave when all the schools came back in, right as that was happening, all the colleges, we had sports stadiums full, all this stuff, and it's gone down 90%. And you have places like Pinellas in most counties where parents had the ability to make decisions about forcible masking or no masking. And then you had some others that forced masking and didn't let the parents make the decision. And it's gone down regardless. It's gone down everywhere. And so we know that. We know that that's what the data is telling us. So we need to make sure that we're doing it. I was very, very saddened and angry to be in Brevard County yesterday and hear a father talk about his young daughter with Down syndrome who has an exemption going into class, and they're forcibly tying a mask on her face with Down syndrome. That is wrong. And so the question is if these folks are not following the law, those parents need to have recourse. They need to go in and they need to be able to sue. They need to be able to get relief. And the perpetrators need to pay for their attorney's fees when they're doing it. We've got to hold people accountable. And it's like, I could sit here and say I tried to put, great young judge on the Florida Supreme Court, a lady named Renata Francis, and we did it. We were about to do it. Someone sued over it, and there was like a procedural issue. I thought I was right. It went, and we lost in front of the Florida Supreme Court. So what am I going to do? I mean, like, we either have a system of government or we don't. And so we did. We made a different decision. Another great judge, and we move on. But you have some of these people that they think that they're a law unto themselves. They don't think the parents should have a voice, and they don't think the interests of the child are more superior to whatever their political interests are. And we're going to make sure that we get that right-sized and make sure that people have the ability to defend parents and defend kids. So I think those two things will be very, very significant. But before I say anymore, I wanted to bring in some folks who will be able to discuss about some of the issues that they're having to deal with, because sometimes you just hear about mandate and force this and that, and it's almost like the folks who are concerned about this, people don't want to talk about, or they don't want to give them the ability to explain kind of where they're coming from on some of this.
That there are anti-mandate and medical procedural pass movements taking place. People are on the streets in huge numbers in Italy, France, and now even in America. What is this new movement? Are medical mandate and pass legislations necessary, or are they an erosion on freedom? This is a serious matter. Let's think about it seriously. Hello, thanks for watching my channel, and thank you for commenting and being involved in this ongoing conversation that we're having together. Today, let's talk about the mandates that are being imposed around medical procedures regarding coronavirus, and let's also talk about the protests that are taking place worldwide. Just to be absolutely clear with you, this is not a video in which I offer you advice on vaccines or any medical procedures, their efficacy, what you should do for yourself or your family. I have no opinion, expertise, or opinion to offer you on that subject. This is simply about these new regulations, these emergency measures and the protests around the world, their efficacy and their veracity, because I want to know what you think about it. Kim Iverson on The Hill said, in numerous countries, thousands upon thousands of people have been protesting vaccine mandates and passports. In Italy, thousands of people have been protesting the country's Green Pass. These protests have been going on for weeks now, and Italy is showing no sign of letting up, despite the fact that over 80% of the population is vaccinated. It's interesting because I've not yet seen any data that outlines what the target percentage is, or what would represent a solution, a satisfactory number of people having had the procedure. Always interesting as well to see the names. Green Pass. They often come up with names that are sort of like friendly. Here's your little cuddle bunion. Here's your little chummy pocket pal. And like as if you're getting coffees, and if you get another one, you get another little stamp, and at the end of it, it's a big bonus coffee. On Friday, Italy set a new bar for major Western democracies seeking to move beyond the pandemic by enacting a sweeping law that requires the nation's entire workforce, public and private, to have government-issued health passes, essentially forcing Italians to choose between getting a pass and earning a living. Many people that I know and listen to have no strong opinion, like me, on the coronavirus, its severity, or the implications around the medical procedures associated with it, but are instead interested in the type of regulations that are being introduced, the mandates that take away a person's free will as to whether or not to have the procedure. That's what concerns a lot of people. With this step, Italy is the first to cross a new threshold. Italy's measures now stand as some of the toughest among Western democracies. Under Italy's new rules, those who do not have a green pass must take unpaid leave. Employers are responsible for verifying the certificates. Workers risk fines of up to €1,500 or about $1,700 for not complying. So this is a pretty serious imposition. Wherever you stand on those medical procedures, surely you have to acknowledge this is a unique situation, and to take a unique stance you would need, I think, data that solidly underwrites the necessity for those kind of new measures. You would have to believe that the problem requires this solution. What do you think? For the past 6 weeks, thousands of Swiss citizens have taken to the streets to protest mandates. Whenever anything happens in Switzerland, I always think, you're meant to be neutral. Why are you being a bit more neutral about it? I don't mean anything against you Swiss people, I'm only mucking about. But it's interesting to think that there are now mandates being introduced in Switzerland, Italy. Good luck trying that in France. They'll have a revolution if you try and put up bus fares by un cent. Amsterdam has seen widespread protests with people carrying signs that read, QR is going too far. Israel sparked widespread protests after the country announced their third booster shot is required for their green pass to be valid in order to be considered fully vaccinated and allowed into most indoor venues. I'm hearing more and more of this kind of legislation and regulation being passed, and there's no doubt that it could be said that that will create a multiply tiered society. In a way, though, these tiers already exist. It's called economic inequality. There's lots of people that can't go anywhere because they're poor. And I bet you'll find that a lot of those people, not because the vaccine costs money, but because of complex social, economic and personal conditions, mean that it's not really an option. Who do you think will suffer most as a result of these kind of mandates? Will it be affluent, rich, wealthy people around the world who can afford multiple complex solutions to any problem? Or will it be ordinary people? The reason that this legislation troubles me is because I think the people that will be most negatively impacted by it are the people that have the most to lose already and are under the most social and economic pressure already. You'll note that that issue is entirely adjacent, outside of the issues of whether or not those procedures are successful, necessary. These are all subjects that don't need to be discussed right here. I prefer to focus on the power of the state, the power of corporations, and the interlocking of those two institutional powers and the way they negatively impact the lives of ordinary people. And for this, you can look at precedents outside of this novel and relatively recent issue. France, get ready. France has seen non-stop protests for some time now. Even before COVID, they're already angry. What's happening? What? Nothing. Well, it's not good enough. The French protests are now over vaccine mandates. Luxembourg citizens protested against their version of a COVID pass. Protesters were all dressed in white, carrying white balloons. I like how people around the world do it better. People in Luxembourg, life is so sort of magnificent, I always assume, because I can't separate Luxembourg from luxury. And then when you hear that they're protesting with white balloons, like it's an opera. We're against these passes. Release the balloons! Thousands of Greek citizens have taken to the streets for the past few months to protest the country's COVID passports and mandates. Some healthcare workers are required by law to be vaccinated, and Greek citizens who are fully vaccinated are issued freedom passports. Don't that get on your nerves when people call things stuff like freedom passport? There's your freedom passport. What does it do? Restricts your freedom and enforces you to do stuff? Thank you, sweet freedom passport. Romanians have been protesting against COVID passports. Thousands of people took to the streets with signs that read, freedom without certificates. There have also been big protests across Australia and New York City. We found it quite difficult to find footage about this. There's some footage on major news network. Let's have a look at how this is being reported.
Freedom, they shout, freedom from a national vaccine mandate. I consider this to be a criminal and cowardly blackmail by our highest institutions, says Maria. There will finally be a revolution in Italy, says Carolina. We won't go to work.
I think some people consider it to be the thin end of the wedge, as it were. You know, that it will start with you have to show proof of vaccination, proof of, recovery from coronavirus or a negative test. Then it might become a little more Black Mirror. You have to show that you've never done anything negative, said anything negative, and now there's so much data accumulated on all of us. We know this, and we know that that data has been illegally gathered in many examples. Don't need me to tell you that. Listen to my episode of Under the Skin with Edward Snowden. Obviously, he's like a world expert, or the other one with Brittany Kaiser from Cambridge Analytica. Data is being accumulated in sort of inconceivable amounts about all of us under the auspices of make sure no one's doing nothing dodgy. Well, now they've got all this data, and so the introduction of mandates and passes at the moment for an issue that many people consider to be worthy of such regulation, it could be applied down the line over anything. This is the thing about affording authoritarianism and tyranny. At some point, it might be for things you agree with, but at some point it might not be, because governments change, the world changes, conditions changes. That's why it's important to have principles and values that are based on something other than your own personal convenience and expedience.
Protests are ramping up across the country as more states and businesses begin to enforce vaccine mandates for employees. In Texas, Southwest Airlines employees protested outside the company's headquarters. And in California, Parents and teachers took to the streets to protest vaccine mandates in schools.
There's an interesting convergence of varied communities coming together, different religious groups, different national identities, different personal and sexual identities, because I suppose the underlying idea is personal autonomy. I imagine you might approach it from your political perspective or your ideological or religious perspective. It's very interesting to see the various ways that people object to erosion on their freedom. Now, of course, some people say, oh, well, this is necessary. It's necessary for the protection of others. But I believe that when you start to investigate the idea that underwrites the civic and social responsibility that we bear for one another, you, of course, one, have to ensure it's a dangerous enough and severe enough problem to warrant those measures. Then you have to think, well, where else might it be applied? The addiction crisis, mental health crisis, problems as a result of pollution, problems as a result of energy use, problems as a result of economic irresponsibility in the financial industry. All of these things, mental health isn't a problem that happens in the mind of an individual. Mental health is a problem that happens across societies. So if we're going to take severe measures in order to protect vulnerable people from this problem, why not take severe measures in order to protect people from that problem? Let me think about it for 1 second. Oh, because in order to stop a mental health crisis, you would have to negatively impact the interests of the powerful. In order to introduce these mandates, you do not have to affect negatively the interests of the powerful. In fact, we've seen over the course of this pandemic a massive transfer of wealth. What an incredible coincidence.
Thousands of parents, teachers, and students across California came out to protest Monday, saying kids shouldn't be kicked out of the classroom just because they're unvaccinated.
Young people, old people, health professionals, people that do jobs like working as flight crew, Australia, like this is now... I'm grateful to the people protesting, not because of any particular opinions I may or may not have, because as you know, I'm like a Luxembourgy balloon of pure light, but because it's important to stand up for certain values and principles.
I am vaccinated, but I do think that people should have a choice on whether they get vaccinated or not.
Well done, Samantha Jolley there. Her personal opinion is that she wants to have the vaccine for reasons that she doesn't need to explain to anybody. But she believes in freedom.
The protests come as vaccination deadlines are closing in around the country.
Luke Kemp, research associate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, says, as the coronavirus has spread, many governments around the world have sought to tackle the pandemic by broadening their powers and abilities according to data collated from the COVID-19 Digital Rights Tracker and Civic Freedom Tracker. A total of 32 countries have used militaries or military ordinances to enforce rules. Others have drawn on technology to grow government oversight. To monitor rule breakers, 22 countries have used surveillance drones. Facial recognition programs have been expanded. Internet censorship has occurred in 28 countries and internet shutdowns in 13. At least 120 contact tracing apps are in use across 71 states and 60 other digital contact tracing measures have been used across 38 countries. I'm reminded of the measures taken against terrorism after the tragic events of 9/11. Many of these measures impacted people so severely and immersively and yet produced, and you can check these figures for yourself, barely any positive results in apprehending potential terrorists or terrorists. So what it seems like is that the measures taken, broadly speaking, benefit already powerful interests, and whilst they're being introduced as a result of this particular set of circumstances, their deployment could be quite broad going forward. Many of these are examples of emergency powers, exceptional actions that states can invoke during a crisis to deviate away from existing laws. According to data from the CoronaNet database, 124 countries declared a state of emergency in response to COVID-19. Now, whether or not you think that is warranted, that's up to you, your personal beliefs. But you will have to accept that these emergency states permit the introduction of emergency laws, and the emergency laws are beneficial to the state, and in this case you might argue, given the economic transfers that have occurred during this period, beneficial to other powerful interests also. Big tech is joined by a cabal of intelligence agencies across the world who have gathered more data and power over the past decades. There is surprisingly little evidence to support the effectiveness of mass surveillance in combating terrorists or viruses. So in both cases, there is no real evidence to suggest that these measures are successful. You can obviously look into that data yourself. Many of the current COVID-19 measures are an acceleration of pre-existing trends. That's interesting as well, isn't it? So while all the rhetoric is this is a unique situation, and even in this video I've talked about the uniqueness, these trends existed prior to the pandemic, meaning I suppose you could say that there was an intention and agenda heading in this general direction anyway. As Reporters Without Borders note, countries with already heavy suppression of media freedom tended to use the coronavirus as an opportunity to intensify their censorial efforts. As one study found, 87% of the global population is now living in countries which can be considered repressed, closed, or obstructed. Emergency powers tend to only go one way, top down. During an emergency, the knee-jerk reaction is always to reinforce those atop hierarchies in the state and significantly curtail the freedoms, voice and agency of citizens, often in a draconian fashion. Some politicians play to the fears that during times of disaster, people will descend into a chaotic mess. Yet, the overwhelming scientific and historical evidence contradicts this pessimistic view of humanity. We're all aware that in many disasters, there are examples of people coming together. For example, the Blitz here in my country, various disasters across America, hurricanes, while of course the media concentrates on looting and disorder because, oh wow, what agenda would that support? So what I hope we can offer you via this video is a set of tools and perspectives to look at the measures being taken around coronavirus with a degree of objectivity, although of course I have my own biases. I've always been somewhat cynical about power. I've always been somewhat cynical about authoritarianism wherever I've encountered it in my life. So take what I say with a pinch of salt also, but please use it in your arsenal of analysis when looking at this issue and the way this issue is being handled, whatever you think about the attitude towards the medical emergency, the degree of emergency that it is, the measures being taken against it, whether legal or medical. All of these things for you to, in my opinion, for you to personally discern, analyze and understand. For us, for me and for you, I'm interested in keeping the debate alive, keeping the conversation going, creating alliances between people who have different beliefs, because if we are unable to do that, then what will happen is we'll be a disparate, diffuse group of people who are very easy to govern and control. The protests that we're seeing around the world should inspire hope in all of you, no matter what you believe in, because as the famous saying goes, first of all they come for A, by the end they're coming for everybody, B, C, D, then the whole alphabet is gone. We have to bind together to stand up for vital, important principles. If you believe in the common good, in looking after the most vulnerable, then rights such as these have to be regarded very, very carefully indeed. But that's just what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Give us a little thumbs up and like. Subscribe to my channel. If you enjoyed this video, have a little look at this saucy little sausage. Or maybe regard this one and sign up to my Awakening side channel. Learn to meditate. Get yourself some spiritual tools to cope with all this. Also, subscribe to my mailing list so I can communicate directly with you every single week. Stay free.
But we start the show with Kyrie Irving. We've been talking about him for months and his vaccination status, and he took to IG Live, so we heard his stance from him. Let's listen to a sample.
Don't believe that I'm retiring. Don't believe that, I'm going to give up this game for a vaccine mandate or staying unvaccinated. Don't believe any of that shit. Like really be aware. What would you do? If you felt uncomfortable going into the season, when you were promised that you would have exemptions or that you didn't have to be forced to get the vaccine. This wasn't an issue before the season started. This wasn't something that I foresaw coming, where I prepared for it. And, I had a chance to strategize on what was going to be best for me and my family. I came into the season thinking that I was just going to be able to play ball.
Jalen, what do you think about hearing it from Kyrie about Kyrie?
So this topic, Jacoby, in particular for black people, I'm going to just cut right to the chase. So, and rightfully so, in the United States of America, we've gained and garnered a distrust for a lot of public service officials, in particular law enforcement and the medical profession. So I understand, just off muscle memory and off of our history, there are a lot of us that are really hesitant as it relates to things we hear and learn about with science and medicine and things of that nature. I had a grandfather, Big Daddy, who didn't want to go to a hospital. And one of his reasons why is at a time he grew up in the United States of America, his relationship was clearly different with the people in the hospital that did not look like him. But this is what I want to say about this topic. Kyrie Irving is not a victim either way. He's not being attacked either way. If he chooses not to get vaccinated, and again, that's his choice, he will still get 50% of his salary this year, which is around $18 million, and he remains unvaccinated. And that's okay. But whether he's vaccinated or unvaccinated, in this case, being unvaccinated does not make him a hero. Like, in so many cases, what we end up doing is, and rightfully so, when you've been a marginalized community, you like to see people rage against the machine. And so in this case, it seems like he's raging against corporate America by not getting vaccinated and taking that stance, which he has the right to take. And because he's taking that stance, he's allowed to keep that stance. But I don't look at it like when Colin Kaepernick took a knee before a football game during the national anthem, or like what Muhammad Ali did, the shoulders of the giants I stand on in front of me. We're conflating the scenarios. He's not a victim. He's not forced to be vaccinated. How about this, Jacoby? I like traveling abroad. I can't go without a passport. That's just the rule. It has nothing to do with me individually. That's just a standard rule. He works for a company, in this case, the NBA or the Nets, that requires him to be vaccinated in order to do his job. And like so very many, he has to make the tough decision. Is he going to get vaccinated either because he feels like it's the right thing health-wise to do, or if he feels like it's something he should do because he wants to protect the well-being of his job and or his career? And a lot of people have been forced to make that decision. But in this case, he's not a poverty-stricken person that decides whether to take it or not, and now he's a hero. It's his choice. I support his choice. He's a fantastic, terrific, wonderful basketball player. I watched all 20 minutes of his IG Live, and I personally like Kyrie a lot. But in this case, anybody that feels like right now your course of action is not to be vaccinated, again, that's your choice. And therefore, you're choosing to deal with the consequences to come with it. And in this case, it's not be able to play basketball.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.
You are most welcome to this talk. Now, unusually on this talk, I will not be giving any of my own opinions. At least I'll be trying hard not to give any of my own opinions. And because we're going to be talking about therapeutics and a drug, I have to tell you, in the rules, I have to tell you that you must never take any drugs based on anything I say in any of my videos. Always go to your own prescriber. This is for educational purposes only. Right, now, having got that out of the way, this report is from the, I'll show you, it is from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences based in New Delhi. So this is a fairly very well known Indian research institution. And the study is on the prophylactic role of ivermectine in SARS coronavirus 2 infection amongst healthcare workers. Now, these are the authors of the paper here, and we see that these are all associated with the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. And this area here is in east of India, in I can't remember the name of the state now, but it's in eastern India anyway. So they're all the authors there. The links are all there for you to look at. This study is dealing with prophylaxis, preventative care. So there's the full paper there. You can read it for yourself. Now, this is a preprint. This is not in a peer-reviewed journal, so you have to take that into account. And the authors say this. They say that on the top. This is a preprint, a preliminary version of a manuscript that's not completed peer review, etc. So read that for yourself. So that's kind of the provisos that are associated with this. But the authors here are, as far as I know, they're all physicians, and they're all associated with the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. So I think at least what they say is worth listening to. So let's dive straight into it. Now, these are the various bits. Research Square seems to be their preprint server, as far as I can gather. And here are all the links. So click on those, check them for yourself. I'm just going to report my best understanding of what they say. So I spent the last few hours reading this paper and going through it, and I think I've got a bit of a gist of it. I'm not saying my interpretation is perfect, but I'm going to give my best interpretation to the best of my ability. So prophylactic. So prophylactic, of course, is that which prevents something. That's which prevents disease in this case. Role of ivermectine in SARS coronavirus 2 infection amongst healthcare workers. Now, background briefly here, healthcare workers are vulnerable to getting infected with SARS coronavirus 2. That is certainly the case. Preventing healthcare workers from getting infection is a priority to main healthcare services. Well, that's true, but it's also important for, well, I would certainly consider it important for me as an individual healthcare worker not to get sick as well. So both are true. We want to look after the individuals and we want to maintain the service. So nothing to disagree with there, really. The next thing, still in the background, the therapeutic and preventative role of ivermectin in COVID-19 is being investigated. That's what this study is about, based on promising results in lab-based in vitro studies of oral ivermectin. This study looks at the prophylactic role of oral ivermectin. So we're looking at the prophylactic role of ivermectin. Now, there are other papers that look at treatment, but I'm sticking... It's actually I wouldn't say it's complicated, but there's a few things to get right. So we're just going to stick in this video to the prophylactic role. Right, method, prospective cohort study was undertaken at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. So that's good. Prospective means the study was done from a particular day going forward. This data was actually collected in, I think it was October, November last year, when this was actually collected. 2 doses of oral ivermectin. The dose was 300, that's micrograms, that's a mu, micrograms per kilogram of the individual's body weight, with a gap of 72 hours. So they give one dose, they'd wait for 3 days, and then they'd give a second dose, 3-day gap. And that's all they gave for the month. That was it. That was considered to be prophylaxis for the month. Now, this presumably is explained by the fact that ivermectin resides in the tissues for a period of time. So just back of the envelope calculation from me, what this means, so 300, 0.3 milligrams is 300 micrograms. It's the same thing. So they were giving, as we said, 300 micrograms. So that's 0.3 milligrams. So if we say the healthcare worker in question weighs 70 kilograms, that would be a dose of 21 milligrams on one day and then a dose of 21 milligrams 3 days later. Now, this is interesting. We had Dr. Tess Laurie, who's one of the, in my view, one of the world's leading medical academics on the channel a few weeks ago. She'd been on twice. Now, she reported that her understanding is that the cost of ivermectin is $168 a kilo, but suppose it's 10 times that. But let's suppose it's $168 a kilo. That means it's 0.168, so is that 16 cents? Anyway, yeah, it is, isn't it? 16.8 cents a gram. So that means a milligram costs $0.00168 for a milligram. And the dose here was 21 milligrams, so that would be associated of a cost of $0.003528. So that would be like 10 cents. That would be 1 cent. So it's a little over a third of a cent, isn't it? By my reckoning. In other words, this doesn't cost anything. So, I mean, what this means is that the cost of preparing this drug and putting it into tablets, it would cost way more, I would have thought, to put it into tablets than it does actually for the drug itself. Very, very cheap to mass produce. And Indian pharmaceutical companies are brilliant at producing huge amounts of generics. There's a very well-established industry in India on that. Now, employees at this institution where this study was done, 3,892 employees, 3,892 employees, 3,523 participated in the study. So pretty good uptake. A lot of them took part in the study. Now, they described it as ivermectine, the ones that had ivermectine. Now, it's slightly confusing, actually, because there was about 5.3% took the first dose and then didn't take the second dose. But the total, so it was about 62%, 62-point-something% took both doses. So there was some poor compliance amongst the staff. But the ivermectin uptake, the group that took 1 or 2 doses, was 2,384 individuals. And as we say, the vast majority of those took the 2 doses. So anyway, that's 67.5% of all the staff. And none uptake, there was 1,114 didn't take it. That's 32.5% of the staff. So you can see there, this is not a randomised controlled trial, but you can see there we've got 2 groups, haven't we? We've got one group took the ivermectin. We've got one group did not take the ivermectin. So it's an ideal comparator group. Now, going on to the results. First of all, development of symptomatic infection. So 331 subjects developed symptomatic infection that may have been COVID, symptoms suggested of COVID-19. And remember, there was quite a few more, wasn't there, in the ivermectin group compared to the non-ivermectin group, what we could call the control group. So there was more in the ivermectin group. But of the 331 who got symptoms, 131 were in the takers group who took the ivermectin, 200 were from the non-takers group. So even though there was more people in this group, less of them got symptomatic infection. And that works out at symptomatic infection. Ivermectin takers, 6% of the whole workforce got symptomatic disease, what may have been COVID-19. Non-takers, 15%. So we see it's more. But of course, the study went on to do PCR testing, of course. And when PCR testing was done, they did PCR tests on 201 individuals. The ivermectin takers, 2% of them got PCR positive. Non-takers, 11.7% got PCR positive. And we see a huge difference there between the 2 groups. So ivermectin, 2% tested PCR positive. Non-ivermectin takers, 11.7% tested PCR positive. Now, the PCR test, of course, is exquisitely sensitive. We all know this. So if the PCR test didn't detect viral load in the ivermectin group, or only in 2% of the ivermectin group, if it didn't detect the virus, that means we can pretty well say there was no virus there, because this test is very sensitive. And you don't need me to tell you that if there's no virus there, you can't transmit it on. So it is highly reasonable to assume that these people would not be infectious as well, because you can't pass on what you haven't got. If I haven't got something in my hand, I can't give it to you. It's obvious. So big difference there. Ivermectin takers, 2% got infected. Non-ivermectin takers, 11.7% got infected, as determined by the PCR test, with obvious implications for transmission. Now, healthcare workers who had taken 2 doses. Now, if they took 1 dose, that didn't seem to make a difference. So 1 dose wasn't enough. They needed 2 doses, 72 hours apart. But the ones who'd taken 2 doses had a significantly, and this is the 0.05 significant level, the 95% significant level, significantly lower risk of contracting COVID-19 disease in the following month, and the relative risk there was 0.18%. In other words, there were only 18% as likely to get it. The adjusted relative risk was 0.17%. In other words, 83% level of protection based on this study. Now, what about adverse effects? Well, 1.8% reported adverse events which were mild and self-limiting, none of which required medical intervention. Most drugs have some side effects, but 1.8% mild and self-limiting side effects. Right, conclusion and relevance. This is not me. This is what the study is saying. This is not me. This is all in here. It's all in here. Check it out. It's got all these sections in. Conclusion and relevance. 2 doses of oral ivermectine, 300 micrograms, that's 0.3 milligrams per kilogram, 72 hours apart, as chemoprophylaxis among healthcare workers reduces the risk of COVID-19 infection by 83% in the following month. And because, as we saw, if they're not testing PCR positive, they can't transmit it on as well. So not only are they being protected, they're breaking the chain of transmission. One would assume. The paper doesn't claim that, but it's hard to think anything else. The authors say safe, effective and low-cost chemoprophylaxis have relevance in the containment of the pandemic alongside vaccine. So they are saying it prevents transmission, basically, without saying it. Now, this is not instead of vaccine. This is as well as vaccine. This is an important point. We need a vaccination. I'm eagerly waiting for my second vaccine. This is as well as. So we want to optimise the health of the immune system with things like vitamin D. We want to prevent the disease with vaccination, but this is another tool that these authors claim has relevance. Director of the All India Institute of Medicine. Earlier, at least 20 to 25 healthcare workers were getting infected with the virus daily. After the workers started taking ivermectin, the number of infections has come down to 1 or 2 per day. So that is his conclusion. Quite an interesting site, actually. Check it out for yourself. Lots of interesting stuff on there. Right, so that's not my opinions. That's just directly from that paper. The best way I am able to communicate it, 83% protection in healthcare workers. So that's the end of this video, but I want to tell you about a couple of spooky things here. Now, I'm not a big social media user really, but students bullied me to having a Facebook page, so I did one years and years ago. I put the links, nothing very interesting on it, but it was basically from a student, so they wanted me to do it, so I did it. And it's been useful for students, different places around the world who appreciate it. Anyway, I put the link for the video we did with Dr. Tess Lowry on Facebook, and we got fact-checked. And again, and of course the one with P.I. Corey got fact-checked. Now, I don't know what I'm allowed to tell you and what I'm allowed to put on really, but it's public domain. So I've put the link in the description. You can click on it and you can read the critique that some person purporting to be an academic wrote up. He didn't indicate on the person writing the critique on here didn't indicate whether they were paid or not. But this is just one report from the there's one report from direct quote from the paper that we've been looking at from the All India Institute of Medicine. The safety of the drug has been established in large-scale use in the last 4 decades for various indications such as onchocerciasis, scabies, head lice and other parasitic infections. This reviewer said that this toxicology data is not relevant to studies of ivermectin in SARS coronavirus 2, which goes against, so this review goes against, that point of that review goes against everything I understand about, or almost everything I understand about toxicology and things like that. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But then again, I might be a bit cognitively challenged in this area. Read it for yourself, it's there, it's in the public domain. So that's what that paper says, 83% protection against healthcare workers, and the cost is essentially zero. So that is a research report from India for your perusal. Thank you for watching.